marriage. It's sometimes referred to as child early and forced marriage. It's any legal or customary union involving a boy or girl below the age of 18. I am mostly going to be talking about girls today because the practice overwhelmingly impacts girls, both in terms of sheer prevalence, but also just in terms of the health, economic, and other consequences that disproportionately burden girls and women. 12 million girls are married each year. That's one girl every 2 seconds. This webinar is supposed to take about an hour, and by the time it's over, 1,800 girls will have been married as children. And yeah, as I noted, worldwide, 650 million women and 150 million men already suffer the consequences of child marriage. If we don't do something to stop this practice now, the global number of women married as children will be 1.2 billion by 2050. And the reason that matters is just that the start of a marriage is often the end of a girl's education. It has enormous impacts on her health and well-being. Girls who are married early also have children earlier and more frequently than their peers, and they also often get trapped in a cycle of poverty and violence. So Girls Not Brides, the organization that I mentioned earlier, has members across the world that are working to raise awareness about the issue, empower those seeking to end child marriage, and to call for global action. And part of that is also giving girls themselves a voice. It was started in 2011 by a group called the Elders. This is an independent group of global thinkers who work together for peace and human rights. It was created by Nelson Mandela and is chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. They really looked at sort of the universe of issues and thought of what they could do that would really affect global poverty, and chose child marriage as one of the first issues to begin to tackle, and that's how Girls Not Brides was formed. I'm going to switch to the next slide. I guess this is just a question for the audience. I went over a little bit of this already, but what areas of a girl's life do you think might be impacted if she marries before she turns 18? And just answer in the chat box. There's no wrong answer. I'm just keen to hear what you think child marriage might do to a girl if she gets married before she turns 18. Oh, and yeah, definitely stalls her education. Anything else? I mean, I can give a straight lecture for the next hour, but I would love to hear from you guys as well. Yeah, absolutely. Her health. Yeah. So you guys are right. It absolutely does have enormous consequences on her health, particularly girls who are married younger than 15. Their bodies are just not ready to have children. And so pregnancy and childbirth can be very detrimental. And girls who are married early, yeah, exactly, tend to have children who are more likely to die in infancy or to experience stunting and other outcomes that their peers who marry later and have children later don't encounter. Children born into adolescence are just not being set up for success. So it affects girls themselves and then the children that they have. I'm going to switch it to the next slide. Yeah, so we're going to focus a lot on India today. Both ICRW and Shadhika have work in India. And it's an important country context to talk about because of just the sheer number of girls that are married there. This chart talks about, it says 20, but I could only fit 10 on the slide, the top 10 countries with the highest absolute numbers of child marriage. India is one of the highest just because it does have one of the highest populations and the sheer number of people that are in India. The country with the highest prevalence in terms of percentage is actually Niger. But looking at India and then looking down this list at the other countries that fall below it, it blows them out of the water in terms of the number of girls that are getting married early, and all of the consequences that we just talked about. So in India, we've seen enormous progress. 27% of girls are married before their 18th birthdays at this point. That's huge. The rates used to be 50%. That said, 27% is still too many. And those numbers are still really high in different states. So in Bihar and Rajasthan, those numbers are as high as 69 and 65%. So almost 70% of girls in Bihar getting married before they turn 18 is really, really tough thing to combat. And India has been working on this issue for some time. Most recently, in 2006, they set the legal age of marriage at 18 for women and 21 for men. That was the Prohibition of Child Marriage Act. It also establishes punishments for those who do not prevent child marriages and created child prohibition officers. It includes the right to annul a marriage if one of the married parties is underage, but it relies on families to report that, and often girls are encouraged or forced into a marriage by their families, so that's not always the most protective factor. They've also drafted a national action plan to prevent child marriage. It was drafted by the Ministry of Women and Child Development in 2013, but it still hasn't been finalized. The government has also tried some other interesting things. They've tried some conditional cash transfer programs and other economic incentives to delay age of marriage, one of which ICRW actually evaluated, and that I'll talk about a little bit later. And they're also a member of the South Asian Initiative to End Violence Against Children, which has a regional action plan to end child marriage. And then finally, India is one of 12 countries in the UNICEF-UNFPA joint program to accelerate action to end child marriage. So there is a lot of great ongoing work, and I'm going to talk now about some of the solutions to child marriage and what all of that means, particularly for India. So before I get started on what those solutions are, what do you guys think we could be doing, sort of we in the global sense, to end child marriage? What do you think a solution might be? And if you don't know, that is okay too. All right, I'm going to keep the chat box open, and if you guys do have any other things that you want to, yeah, community education, educating young women themselves, cash transfers to girls and their families, yes, working with village elders. Great. So some of the historic responses to child marriage actually started at a different level than what you guys have discussed. Some of the historic responses to child marriage were really at the legislative and policy level. Interestingly, India was one of the first countries to have a legislative mandate on child marriage. They set a law in 1929 setting a minimum age of marriage. And since then, we've seen more legislative reform in other countries. We have seen sort of on-the-ground programs starting following Cairo in 1994 and Beijing in 1995. The UN has taken on this issue and has done several resolutions on child early and forced marriage. As I noted, Girls Not Bride was launched by the elders. There are regional campaigns in Africa and Asia. And in 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals actually include a very specific target to end child marriage under Goal 5. And this is really critical because the Millennium Development Goals were critical in driving significant progress in several areas, such as improved primary school enrollment, reduced incidence of malaria and other diseases, and they really did do some great work to sort of drive the globe to work together against common goals. Where they fell short was on gender equality, but particularly they fell short of addressing girls and girls' needs and ways to set girls up for success. So advocates worked really hard to make sure that adolescent girls' empowerment, girls' voices were really heard ahead of setting this next global agenda. And I'm really proud to say that girls are referenced 11 times across the agenda's 17 goals. And I think it's important to mention that if we don't end child marriage, if it's allowed to continue at the rate that it currently is going on at, we won't be able to achieve Goal 5, gender equality, but we also won't be able to achieve 7 other development goals that are related to child marriage. In particular, those are ending poverty, addressing nutrition, health, education, gender equality, water and sanitation, economic growth, inequality, safe cities, climate change, and inclusive societies. So I think it's really important to note that this is not a small issue. It has enormous impacts and ripple effects across a number of other issue areas. So the solutions to end child marriage. Yeah. This is one of ICRW's seminal pieces of research. We looked across a series of different programs working to empower girls and to end child marriage, and found that these 5 solutions are necessary to really create the enabling environment to end child marriage. So it's empowering girls with information, skills, and support, educating and mobilizing parents and community members. I saw a comment earlier about village elders. That's absolutely a part of it. Enhancing accessibility and quality of formal schooling, offering economic support and incentives for girls, some of those cash transfer programs that we talked about, and then fostering and enabling legal and policy framework and enforcing that legal and policy framework are also critical. And these solutions don't exist in silos. All 5 of them need to happen to really end child marriage. And different actors working in different spheres, but sort of in harmony, is the way that we are going to achieve that. Yeah, so I just noted that the solutions to end child marriage is something that really sort of laid the groundwork. ICRW was one of the first organizations to call child marriage what it is. We previously didn't really have the language to talk about early marriage or teen marriage, and we developed the language around child marriage. And those 5 solutions that I just mentioned are copied almost verbatim into the US Global Strategy to Empower Adolescent Girls. It's the first ever of any government strategy to address adolescent girls and their holistic needs. There are 7 government agencies that have signed on to implementing the strategy. And not just because ICRW's research is cited heavily throughout, but because I really think it's a beautiful policy document. It's one of the most encouraging things that we've seen to really harness the full power of the US government. So it includes State Department, USAID, Millennium Challenge Corporation, Peace Corps, the Department of Labor, and USDA, all sort of working together to dip into those pieces to empower girls. So I'm very proud of that. The next slide should say where we are today. Okay. So this is a program that ICRW works on in India. It's called the Gender Equity Movement in Schools. No, it's okay. We can do we can do gems. So this is one of the solutions that ICRW has identified, where we have tried to really tackle some of those root causes of child marriage. So it's a program that works with 6th and 7th graders. It's over 2 years. It's 24 lessons. And it's a really cool program. It teaches kids to think critically about gender norms, because the real root cause of child marriage is gender and equitable norms that prioritize education and economic opportunity for boys and marriage and motherhood for girls. And so taking on a program like this that doesn't necessarily feed children any of the answers, it just asks a lot of critical questions and has these guided discussions about what is gender, what are gender roles. When you go home from school, do you get to play cricket or soccer? And does your sister get to go home and play cricket or soccer? And if she's going home and she's doing chores or she's helping take care of your little sister, why is that? Why are those roles different? And is that fair? Is that what, you want it to be? What kind of world would you like to see when you grow up? And so it's really empowering kids to make decisions for themselves about the kind of roles that they want to see. We've been doing it for about 10 years now, and we've seen some really exciting results, both in terms of attitude change and behavior change. And just also part of the program includes talking with parents. So sort of taking that conversation home and seeing how we can maybe challenge some of the underlying root causes that lead girls to be married early. This is an example of like one of the worksheets. So it's, a multiple choice thing. Like girls usually do not play cricket because biologically it's not possible for them to play cricket. And it's really interesting. I got to see an adaptation of this program that we worked on in Vietnam, actually. And it was great to talk to the kids because as funny as some of these answers might seem, they really believe like girls just aren't built that way. Like girls can't be strong. Girls can't drive. They can't do these things. And so it's interesting to see them really consider those norms that, they take for granted and think about what's real in the future that they want to create. Another program that we are working on is PAGE, and it's just building the empowerment and employability skills of girls. We work with girls ages 15 to 17, that's grades 9 through 11, to sort of create demand among girls and their families to continue their education. So really working with girls to ensure that they are continuing their education, not only so that they stay in school and so that they're safe and they're being, educated, but so that they can make that school to work transition. So it includes some hard skills, but it also includes a bit of soft skills and developing some agency and the ability to engage and work with diverse employers. The last project that I'm going to talk about that ICRW works on in India is Planet Girls. This one is a little bit newer, but it's really very exciting. We're using an ecosystem model where girls are at the center, but we're also talking to sort of their whole ecosystem of influencers, so their families, communities, male peers. We're working with school administrators and teachers. We're working with the private sector, the government, and are just integrating gender, life skills, and employability so that we're creating an empowered future generation. And then I'm going to sort of leave us with, while we're making a lot of progress and we know a lot of what works in terms of the solutions, we have these global goals. We have a lot of these really exciting projects and programs that are working to empower girls, make girls more employable, keep them in school. What we still are hearing is, for the most part, a lot of rhetoric and not a lot of investment on behalf of government donors and private foundations. Because of that, ICRW undertook some research with the World Bank. We looked at data from 25 countries and specific data from 15 countries to really get at what is child marriage costing us. We looked at these 5 domains of impact based on a lot of the research of what we know about child marriage and how it affects a girl's life. So we looked at fertility and population growth, health and nutrition, education, labor force participation, and then agency, decision making, and that kind of thing. I am not a researcher, so I cannot describe to all of the multifaceted analysis that went into this. But I will say that of the 25 countries for which detailed analysis was conducted, at least 1 in 3 women who marry before the age of 18 and 1 in 5 women have their first child before they turn 18. We intentionally chose high prevalence countries, and we looked at countries in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. So while we couldn't do detailed analysis for every country in the world that experiences child marriage, we do feel that this data is globally representative, and does really show the economic effect of child marriage. So I listed those 5 domains earlier. This is just an infographic I created to show that they're not dependent variables, they're very much interrelated. So this shows a girl who either stays in school or gets married as a child. The girl who gets married early has more children earlier than her peers. She still participates in the labor force. We did not find that child marriage had any effect on labor force participation. What we did find is that because girls both have a decreased level of education and because they keep having to drop out of the labor force as they have children and care for those children, they see a 9% loss in earnings over the course of their lifetimes. So this really has an enormous effect on their ability to provide for themselves, provide for their families. Girls who stay in school, in the countries we studied, still tend to get married and they still tend to have children. They just do that later and then they have fewer children. They still participate in the labor force, but they're able to attain jobs that are better paying, and they're not leaving the labor force as frequently to have children and experiencing some of the health consequences of having frequent childbirths. So they see increased earnings. That means that they're able to take better care of their kids and their families, and it has a huge impact on economies. And yeah, so as I mentioned, Niger is the country with the highest prevalence rate in terms of, percentage of girls married. So if you look at Niger alone, if we could have just magically ended child marriage in 2015, 15 years later, by 2030, when the global goals are set to end, it would have led to $1.7 billion in annual welfare benefits, $327 million in savings to the education system, and $34 million due to reduced infant mortality and $8 million due to reduced stunting. So when you take data like that and you extrapolate it globally, what you see is that child marriage is costing the world trillions of dollars. Should be one more slide. Oh, I guess that one got moved. There used to be a slide in here that just had a quote from a girl. And I just wanted to sort of end by saying that while we are making some progress and it is very encouraging, we are still talking about very real girls who are often forced into marriages against their will and then not taught about their bodies and having children earlier and more frequently than they're prepared to do, and that this has enormous mental health consequences. The data that we collected did show that overall psychological well-being for girls, particularly those who marry under age 18, is not as high as those who marry later. They have higher levels of depression and anxiety. And since we know that one of the top causes of death for girls 15 to 19 is suicide, I do think it's just important to note that this practice has really huge impacts on the girls themselves, as well as the economic impacts for the global economy. Thank you. I'll turn it over to Sarah now to talk more about Shadhika's work.
Rachel, I want to say thank you so much for your presentation. Everyone, we will get a chance to ask Rachel some more questions. And Rachel, I want to thank you for being such a good sport with the slides being mixed up. I am going to spend a little bit of time talking about Shadhika's work. And what I find so interesting listening to Rachel speak about the findings of their study is that a lot of these issues and interrelatedness of the different facets of child marriage are things that Shadhika is working to directly impact. So we believe in a kind of lifelong approach to working with a girl. We start with girls ages 10 through 18, and that is kind of step one. And this is the step that I'm going to focus on the most in our talk today. And that is our goal of supporting young women in their pursuit to finish high school. That really is a big key factor in preventing child marriage, because if you're staying in school, oftentimes what you've done is won your parents over in support of you finishing your education, and that pushes any sort of marriage thoughts for a lot of the young women we work with to the back burner. And so that's what I'm going to spend the most time talking about. But after you finish high school, and once you've kind of avoided that window of time where you would be considered a child marriage, we don't want to stop there. So Shadhika, in our step 2, we focus on allowing young women the opportunity to pursue their dreams. And the way we do that is by our college scholarship program. So that program has been around for about 4 years, and we just actually saw our first class of college graduates, which is happening this week and next. So we're really excited to see what these girls are able to do in their future, and we know that they are so well poised to take charge of that. After college, we are invested in helping them get a job and become economically self-sufficient. And this is a goal that college does play into, but the young women that Shadhika works with come from some of the most disadvantaged backgrounds in India. And oftentimes these girls don't have access to the sort of information that we do in terms of even just knowing what jobs are out there and available to them, knowing how to comport themselves in a workplace, knowing how to do an interview. And so our program that is focused on life skills and job readiness dives into some of those issues. And then what we hope to see these young women doing is using the knowledge and the skills that they have gained through their pursuit of these different facets of their lives to transform their communities. We want to see this as a circular process in which young women are able to remain in their communities and change minds there, because we believe that the smallest change in one girl can have ripple effects on herself, on her family, on her community, and then hopefully on the greater world as a whole. So like I mentioned before, we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about step 1. This is for girls ages 10 to 18 years old. And these are the reasons that we start there. So our data is actually a little bit older. The 2017 numbers that Rachel shared with the 27% of Indian girls getting married before the age of 18 has been a huge milestone in reducing that number. Just as I think as late as 2016, the number was 40%, 47% of girls. So really the focus that we have on India is because working in India can have a huge impact on the numbers globally. And then another kind of statistic about the context in which we're doing our work in India is that less than 21% of girls complete high school. It kind of is, we know that India is a very populous country, but something that always puts it into perspective for me is that 1 out of every 5 girls in the world lives in India. So that's 20% of the world's girls living in India, and only 21% of those girls are completing high school. And so our goal is to see that pattern changed and to support young women in their pursuit of finishing their education. And the way that we're doing that is kind of 5-fold. If you see here our response, One thing that we focus heavily on in most of our programs is English tutoring. This sounds silly, making young women in small communities in India focus on learning English, but India is an interesting schooling system where your secondary school and your elementary school are taught in the language of your community. But any further education, college or postgraduate work, is all done in English. And, I always like to think of speaking English my entire life and suddenly having to go to college in France and take classes in French. It would be nearly impossible for a lot of people here to do that, and it's just as impossible for the young women that we're working with. So our English tutoring program focuses on preparing them for that higher education. We also have a computer skills program, and this really is so important in today's world. I can't imagine having any sort of productivity without a computer, yet many of the young women that we work with have never used one before and need that basic understanding of how to use Microsoft Word, how to use Tally, which is their kind of QuickBooks software, those types of programs that they need to be successful in their education. We work with them to provide that. We also have a life skills and sex education course. These are courses designed to help these young women be successful in their future, whether it is pursuing a college degree or pursuing a job straight out of high school. These courses are really designed to empower them to make decisions about their own lives in ways that they haven't thought about making decisions before. And that kind of folds in with the last 2 points there, which is leadership development and rights training. Our approach to our work is teach a man to fish, to use a kind of common colloquialism. But we believe that these young women are the best advocates for their own lives, and that's not a role that we can play for them as persistently as they can. So we want these young women to know their rights, to be able to stand up for themselves and to take on leadership roles in their communities. And that's something that we've definitely been able to see happening. Our impact. We have worked with over 1,300 young women in 6 different communities in India. And what we've seen is that 96% of the girls enrolled in our programs have completed high school, which is kind of a dramatic rate compared to the 21% of national average. And we have had a 95% of our young women have escaped child marriage or forced marriage, which we're pleased with, but we would love to see that number get to 100%. And like Rachel mentioned, we don't want this to be just statistics. So I really want to make this real for you guys. And I'm going to share a story of a young woman that we work with. Her name is Vidya, and she is a student at one of our partner sites. She's actually in Bangalore, and she is with a site called Bale Mane. Bale Mane is a home for girls who have been abandoned, orphaned, or rescued from child labor. And Vidya has been living at Bale Mane for most of her life since she was very young. She was a sophomore in high school. She was getting ready to think about her future, and she was excited to pursue a college scholarship. And she actually was looking forward to moving out of the community and taking charge of her own life. But she has a pretty harrowing story from child marriage. So when she was 16 years old, she was kidnapped by an extended family member who knew that she was there and wanted to force her into an arranged marriage in order to make money for his family. And this is not an uncommon story that we've heard anecdotally from the young women we work with, but it's a pretty shocking one. She was able to escape from him, and over the course of 4 days made it back to Balemane. They took her 50 miles away, so it took her quite some time and a lot of determination to make it back. But she did, and we are happy to report that she is now a college scholarship recipient from Shadhika and is going to be graduating with next year's cohort. So we're really happy to see her growth. The quote that is on the screen is something she wrote in an exercise that she was participating in during one of the life skills courses. She was asked to write a letter to her future daughter that discussed her hopes and dreams and her advice for her daughter. This was something that we pulled out. You should play with your friends, not your own children. And I think that is a really profound and kind of human piece of the child marriage discussion, is that these girls oftentimes are children, and they need to play and they need to be children. And that is why we are doing the work that we're doing. That is why all the research is happening regarding child marriage, and that's why we're so happy to be part of a coalition like Girls Not Brides, and to be learning from groups like Rachel's in terms of how to best address these problems. So with that, I want to move into the question and answer section. If you want, you can type your questions in the chat box, or you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask questions for Rachel or for myself about Shadhika. We're happy to entertain all of them. Rachel, I know we got a question in the chat box earlier that was for you. I'm happy to ask that. It was, what kind of punishment is applied in cases of not preventing child marriage or encouraging it?
Yeah, because I work on U.S. foreign policy and not Indian policy, ICRW does have an India office. I am not sure the specifics of Indian law, so I'm not actually super comfortable answering that question. I do know that my Indian colleagues have expressed some frustration that the laws and policies are not consistently enforced, and that that's part of the issue. But beyond that, I can't really speak to specifics.
Yeah, I think the tough thing about India is that there's so many states and municipalities that are involved that it can be difficult to really give a solid answer to a question like that. But I did say in the chat box, and I'll share it with all of you following the webinar, there was a recent article about a child marriage that was stopped right before it was performed in one state in India, and the perpetrators, being the girl's father and some of the other men in the community who were encouraging it, were actually sought by the police and arrested. And that is a story we don't often hear. India is a challenging place in that enforcement of laws is often hit or miss. So we do have some answer to that question, but not a general answer that's going to be super specific. But I'm happy to share that article with everyone after. Do we have any other questions?
Yeah. Can you hear me? This is Pallavi.
Yes, we can.
Hi there. So my question is, when you, in your work on the ground with these families, do you find more success with the families that already have a desire to increase education for their kids and opportunities for their girls? Like, I think of the name Vidya, which means knowledge in and of itself, or is there a lot of mind changing that has to happen, or is it a combination?
It's definitely a combination of the two. The stories that we hear from the young women who are pursuing education vary. Sometimes it's the family is wholeheartedly behind their education, but they can't afford certain aspects of it. And so that's why they're part of our program. But we've also had so many stories of parents who were very resistant to their daughters pursuing education. And I have found that most of that resistance comes from an economic standpoint, where if the young woman were to get married, then she's no longer a financial responsibility for her immediate family members. She becomes kind of the financial responsibility of her husband and her husband's family. So oftentimes that is one of the reasons why these young women are being married young. But part of our program requires that parents consent to allowing their daughters to finish the program. And this is really in an effort to build that kind of family buy-in so that there's not as much pressure to quit this program as there could be if her family were against it. We've heard amazing success stories in terms of young women winning their fathers over. One of my favorite stories is a young woman whose father said, I will allow you to go to college for 1 year on a scholarship. And if I don't think it's doing anything for your life, then I'm pulling you out. And she convinced him to let her go for that 1 year. And by the end of her first year in college, her father was waking up at 4 a.m., walking her to the train station, and waiting at the train station when she returned in the evening to walk her home to hear all about her day. And he has become one of her most avid supporters. And just on the 13th of July, last Friday, spoke to a graduation crowd about how he has been encouraging his family members and his friends to send their daughters to college. And it's kind of that ripple effect that we're hoping to see, right? I think when your community is not supportive of something new that you're trying to do, whatever it is, in this case, allowing your daughters to pursue education, it's hard and it's a scary thing to do. But the families, in large part, we have heard their eyes have been open to what their daughters can do with their lives. And it's a really heartwarming and encouraging step that they're taking, but we'd love to see that attitude spreading to more and more families in their communities. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks. No, I was just curious because, being Indian myself, I even can think of the terms in my head that are used to describe, the fears that parents have when they're either sending their daughter out in the world, giving her more of an education. So I'm just curious to know, in these specific cases where you're seeing the most success. And also I'm thinking of it from a strategy perspective, which you guys already have, which is you focus on those girls that do have the family support so you can ensure a better outcome for success, or do you spend your energy and resources on convincing the families to support their daughters, which is also important, but again, I was thinking of it more in terms of where can you see the most success, and so yeah, it pretty much answers it.
Yeah, and I think the way that we do our work is through partner organizations who are women-led organizations on the ground in India. And they provide so much support to these young girls. They're with them every day. And our goal and our strategy there is that they provide a support system to these young women outside of their own families, a support system of strong women who are pursuing the same things that these young women hope to pursue. And with our support and with the organization support and with a little bit of family buy-in, we really think that is setting them up for as much success as, as we can possibly. And then the rest of it is up to them to pursue their goals vigorously and make it, stand up for themselves. So, we hope, and I feel that we're providing the right kind of support. There's always more that we can do, and our programs are always shifting to address new things that we find. But I think we're in a pretty good place right now. Let's see. We had another question in the chat box. Do we know of any shelters for runaway brides in India or in other countries? Some churches in Guinea-Bissau are sponsoring precarious shelters for such cases. And as I'm not sure that I know of any in India, but that's definitely something that we could look into, and I'm happy to send you that information following the webinar. Do we have any more questions? Well, I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I hope you learned something new about child marriage. I want to say thank you to Rachel for presenting her information and that those amazing statistics. Just as a follow-up, we will be doing one more quarterly webinar. It will be in November, and it's going to be focused on violence against women in conjunction with the Orange the World campaign by the United Nations. So make sure to keep your eyes out for that. My contact info is here, and then you should follow Shadhika on all social media if you haven't already. And we'll be sending out a recording of this webinar to everyone in case you want to share it with anyone who might be interested. Thank you so much.